Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin Session 1, World in Turbulence. This session will be moderated by Ms. Karen House from the Belfer Center at Harvard University. Ms. House, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. A world in turbulence is not just a scary phrase. Unfortunately, has already been made clear here today. It's a reality. So we're going to have my extended family here speak on this topic for 5 minutes each, and then some discussion, which hopefully will compare and contrast and connect the views of people on the panel, and then obviously audience questions and comments, which is the most important, to try to focus on what are the critical fault lines of confrontation between great powers. What impact will that have on the global order? How do other countries navigate those fault lines? As the global order transitions, what is its fate? Does global order become, in a sense, an extinct phrase? And how should the international community, including South Korea and other countries, respond to ensure their common security and prosperity? I spend a lot of time in Saudi Arabia, and it's the other, what people call middle power, like South Korea. I mean, Turkey, there are many, but South Korea and Saudi Arabia, to me, have a lot in common because they're both at different levels, partners, are, in South Korea's case, allies who have begun to lose some faith in the U.S. So how we navigate a world in which people have less and less faith in us and look for alternatives to handle the issue is one I'm personally very interested in. Because we've heard from many Americans and Koreans today, I'm going to start with the Chinese member of my extended family. Jia Qingkuo is a professor and a former dean of the School of International Studies at Peking University. He's a Cornell graduate and somebody who spends a lot of time in the U.S. as well as many other places. And he's a member of the Standing Committee of the 13th National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. So with that, we look for 5 minutes of succinct and pointed comments from you.
Well, thank you, Chair, and many thanks to Asan Institute for the invitation and also to Chairman Chong's invitation. It's great to catch up with some good friends in person after 3 years of separation because of COVID restrictions. The topic, well, let me put it at the beginning. I don't speak for the Chinese government. If you expect that, you'll be disappointed. The topic of this panel is the world in turbulence. I think the topic itself captures the thinking of almost everyone in this room about this world. Hence, instead of going through the problems in the world, I want to tell you how I felt in recent years. On New Year Eve, about 5 years ago, I felt something very different. I realized that unlike in the previous years, when some countries were not happy, but some others are happy. This year, nobody was happy. Then a couple of years later, again on the New Year Eve, I suddenly felt that last year was better than this year. And this year may be better than next year. At the time, I thought I had the feeling because I'm getting old. But then, many of my friends also feel this way. And today, Ambassador Bolton's remarks reconfirmed that kind of a feeling I have. I guess that tells you something about the situation of this world. It is indeed in turbulence. As a scholar, I like to speculate on things. I think you will bear with me for the remaining minutes of my time. This year's Asan Plenum is designed to celebrate the 70th year's anniversary of the ROK-US alliance. It indeed deserves celebration. Just think, in history, how many military alliances that lasted for such a long time and moreover still remain vibrant. Okay. And you feel good about it on top of that. Not many. Okay. In fact, very few. Therefore, the alliance is a miracle. And for this reason, some other US alliances also deserve celebration. Okay. Having said this, however, it is not without a bit of irony that you still need the alliances more than 70 years it was established. And to some extent, and to some, you need the alliance more than ever. Okay. Why? The world has become more turbulent and less safe. Obviously, there are limits as to what alliances can do. I guess to make the world a safer place, countries need to go beyond military alliances. This is, by the way, by no means to belittle the importance of the military alliances. To begin with, countries need to improve themselves to make themselves stronger and more prosperous, to build better infrastructure, to combat drugs at home, to distribute wealth of the rich more to the poor and needy, and in a word, build themselves stronger and more prosperous. Second, at the international level, countries need to maintain a free and open trading system, inclusive security arrangements, and platforms for cooperation to address various kinds of global challenges. Finally, countries need to make friends with all possible countries to make good use of their resources to help maintain the international order and to address various kinds of global problems, rather than squandering their resources at confrontation with each other. Is it too much to ask countries to do? Yes and no. Yes, because it is indeed very difficult, and even like mission impossible. No, because this is the only way to make it possible that tomorrow is better than today. And you never know whether you can do it after you have tried. One thing we can hope for this is that pragmatists and rational people of countries cooperate and work together to make ourselves strong and international cooperation possible, making sure that ideological and security fundamentalists in our respective countries do not hijack our future in pursuit of their absurd goals. Okay. We have people like this. Okay. I'm in some WeChat rooms in which we have warmongers, talk in ways that make you feel extremely uncomfortable. In a word, we need to do more than celebrating and enhancing military alliances to make the world less turbulent and more peaceful and prosperous tomorrow. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Ed Fulner, who we heard from last night, so you're pretty familiar with him. But as he said, he has run the Heritage Foundation for 36 years and spends a lot of time in this country. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen, very much for giving me this opportunity for learning from you, as I always do. And when I think about a world in turbulence, watching television last night, I thought there's probably only one person who's here who could actually go to a map right now and point out where Khartoum is. And here we are with a new confrontation,
yeah.
a new challenge in Sudan. But that one person, of course, is you, because you've done so much in terms of Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia. And of course, China's role in terms of Saudi Arabia, Iran is something that's a big challenge that confronts us in terms of what our role traditionally has been in the Middle East. And it's something that, and Professor, I'm so glad you're not speaking for the PRC government, because I was going to ask you about what another new challenge, what the Chinese ambassador to France said yesterday on French television, that China does not recognize the fact that the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the stands in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, etc., are not part of Russia. That was kind of a remarkable comment from an official speaker of the PRC's foreign ministry, particularly since at least 3 of the countries he specifically mentioned are members of NATO. And to say that they're still part of Russia kind of made a lot of us scratch our heads. When I think as an American right now, and I was particularly impressed by one of the points John Bolton made this morning when he talked about some of the forward thinking that's been going on in terms of AUKUS, in terms of the Quad potentially becoming the Quint. But when he also talked in general terms about why it's essential that we work as closely together as we possibly can in terms of developing new forms of alliances. And both Bolton and John Hamre talked very specifically about the first I that I talked about last night in my welcoming comments, the I of ideas. One of the ideas that I thank our honorary chairman, Chung Mung Joon, to have reintroduced to so many of us, the idea of reviewing and revisiting the whole question of nuclear capability, extended deterrence that Hamre talked about, et cetera, that these are not only challenges, but they're also something that we can work together in terms of dealing with as we look beyond the 70th anniversary. So in that idea, MJ, you as an individual brought to our attention, and through the institution, the third eye, the Asan Institute, you've reminded us repeatedly about why this is something that we as Americans have to reaffirm in terms of our own commitment on both a bilateral and a regional basis. And one of the things related that I hope will come out of the Washington summit is my own deep admiration for what President Yoon has done in terms of finally lowering some of the historic thresholds between Korea and Japan. And talking with other panelists, I've heard that, in fact, right now, intelligence sharing between the United States, Japan, and Korea is probably better than it's been in a very, very long time, which is very encouraging to those of us who look for ways to strengthen our alliances and our opportunities to work together. Final point that I think is worth remembering. Sorry, Professor, I was one of those naive people 30 years ago who called together the heads of every major think tank in Washington. We had Brookings and Cato and AEI and Peterson and Heritage, and we all went to the National Press Club and we all said, yes, China should join the World Trade Organization. Yes, China should get most favored nation status. Today, China still enjoys developing nation status, which means it gets subsidies. It's eligible for World Bank subsidies. It gets concessions that, frankly, I and many others on our side don't think it should have. And it's something that is one of those critical challenges that I hope we will be talking about during the course of the rest of today in terms of, frankly, how we here, not only as Americans, but as Koreans, and Korea is this little place in between its very large trading partner on one side and its very large security partner on the other side, and it can be squeezed kind of in the middle. As I've said, I've heard from some of my Korean colleagues here over the last day, security comes first. And I think that's one of the questions that we have to look at as we go 70 years and beyond. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Everybody's being so good with their brevity of their comments. The next speaker is Maria Castillo Fernandez. Ambassador Fernandez is the EU ambassador to Seoul and has also served as ambassador in Malaysia and was the in charge of EU relations with North and South Korea in Brussels. So she's obviously well steeped in all of these issues, so we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for having me here. It's and having a bit the European perspective, which is very important because what is happening in Europe matters here the same as what is happening here matters on the other side. The world has changed, yes. We are more into a multipolar disorder, perhaps. But what is important for us is that universal values, UN principles, are all put into question. In many of the crises, the theaters of conflict that we see today. And there is an offer for a new international order with perhaps China at the center. And that is of concern to us. The importance of the values and United Nations principles, which we all the countries have adhered to, they are part of United Nations, and these are upheld. We see it in Ukraine, where Russia has certainly breached international order, violating a country which is sovereign to territorial integrity, using force to invade a country for no reason. And therefore there we ask China, for example, as a UN Security Council, to safeguard the UN principles. I think they shoulder more responsibility for this. And they have to play a more constructive role in resolving this issue. 141 countries around the world approved the UN resolution on just peace. And I think that says a lot about a need to uphold these international principles. We see that also in freedom of navigation. This is about UNCLOS. We forget about UNCLOS, but this is the law of the sea, and we have also all signed about it. And this is in the Indo-Pacific, where Korea is here. It is about Taiwan Strait. It's about Malacca Strait. When I was serving in Malaysia, it was South China Sea, the importance. And for Europe, most of our trade passed through these waters. So this is also very important for us. And when things happen and there is instability in this part of the world, it matters to all of us. This is about NPT. This is about nuclear non-proliferation, and of course the threat of DPRK again in this part of the world, and all the debate that we have been hearing in the last months and last year here in Korea about being nuclear node, which has an impact. This is about Korea is an NPT, South Korea is an NPT member, and we want them to stay and to uphold these principles. This is not about the West against the South, against the others. This is about, principles that we all have united principles that we all have adhere, and we need to strengthen them. The other point I want to say is about economic security. We are all speaking about this. You said security comes first, even in economy, I will say. And we are all speaking about it. We are all trying, in a way, to diversify our supplies. We are trying to reconfigure our value chains. Korea is doing this. China is doing this as well, in a way. But this is a risk, because if we, try to find also other markets, these markets will also buy more, for example, for China in order to serve Europe. And then what happens? And they are more vulnerable to pressure and threats. So we have to see that risks that come with also our economic security. Alliance, Professor, I do agree, but alliance need to be balanced. And when alliances are not balanced, that creates problems. And that is, for example, what perhaps we have with China now, where there is an enormous deficit, trade deficit from our side, and that makes the relation and on the level playing field that doesn't exist. A last word on other partners. Karen, you mentioned Saudi Arabia. There is India, Brazil, Indonesia, South Korea. I see many of my colleagues here from other countries. We need to speak to all. We need to reach to all, and just to try to defend that the principles we all adhere are good and work and can bring prosperity and security. And if we need to talk to perhaps upgrade our institutions, our international institutions, we need to work together. And this is about building up partnerships. When we hear about Korea GPS, I want to see Korea much more forthcoming, speaking also about values and principles, because it's not only us who has to do it, it has to be reach out, and I sometimes hear many of my colleagues also speaking about that. That is our principles, our values, and this is what is important. So let's try and see and find ways bringing everyone together. Sometimes perhaps they think different as we do, but that doesn't mean that we need to reach out and have an open communication with all of them.
Thank you. I'm going to go to another American, Mr. Shriver. Randall is a partner in the Pacific Solutions and the chairman of the board of Project 2049. I had the pleasure of hearing you speak recently in a small group in Washington. So you are, and he is a former Assistant Secretary of Defense too, so again, well steeped in all these issues. So.
Great, well thank you. It is a turbulent world, and it is unsettling to look at our TV and see a nighttime operation to evacuate our embassy in Khartoum. Mm-hmm. But I do think the defining events and most significant events of this era will emanate from the unfolding U.S.-China strategic competition. President Biden went to Bali in November to find the floor and build the guardrails. That was before the spy balloon incident. That was before Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow. That was before Tsai Ing-wen's transit through the U.S. and the Chinese military reaction to that. So I'm not sure we found the floor yet, and we certainly haven't had much opportunities to build the guardrails. So I think U.S. actions will still unfold, and policies will still unfold to really strengthen our competitive posture vis-a-vis China for as far as my eyes can see. And so what I want to describe are a few lines of effort that I think we'll see from the administration with help from Congress. I should use air quotes, help from Congress, with entities like the Select Committee on China. But I think this will help to define a sort of action-reaction cycle in the U.S.-China relationship, but also will really inform the work that we'll be undertaking in the region more broadly, particularly with friends and allies. So just briefly, I think, number one, you'll see continued efforts to try to right-shape the economic and trade relationship with China. I say right-shape because we heard from Secretary Yellen and USTR Rep. Tai that we're not decoupling completely. We want a normal trade relations of sorts. with China, but clearly actions like October 7th of last year to tighten export controls will continue in key strategic sensitive sectors. Maybe biopharma is one of the next sectors to look at. And we will need to have a suite of policies that not only put some restrictions on the U.S.-China relationship, but really improve our position throughout the region at a time when we're not in the business of regional trade liberalization anymore. IPEF is what it is. It's an empty vessel. I'm afraid it remains pretty empty and leaves a lot of our partners wanting, particularly when it comes to market access. But really, it's a bipartisan problem in the United States, which we've been unable to break out of. So this right shaping and reassurance to partners and allies is going to have to unfold in a pretty tough environment politically. Number two, you'll see a lot of focus on strengthening deterrence. I think first and foremost, that'll be directed at a potential Taiwan contingency. So that'll have several elements, providing arms to Taiwan for its own defense, particularly in counter-invasion and counter-blockade scenarios. You'll see attempts at strengthening posture and access opportunities for U.S. forces in the region. You know, we're still really in a legacy posture from World War II and the Korean War. That's probably very appropriate for Korea, given the threats from the north, but would make a contingency like Taiwan challenging in that we're very concentrated in the region in our forward deployed posture. So being able to fight in a dispersed, distributed manner requires greater access throughout the region with partners and allies, so there'll be work on that. And then this idea of integrated deterrence, bringing in the economic aspects and the cost imposition aspects of that deterrence, need to be built out really in advance. You know, we talk about the impressive cost imposition on Russia, and sometimes we forget deterrence failed. Ukraine was invaded, tens of thousands of people killed, hundreds of thousands of refugees. For this to have a fighting chance in the Indo-Pacific, it needs to be built out in a way that's credible, convincing, and shows that costs will be absorbed by the Chinese if they make a decision to move against Taiwan or some other decision to upset the free and open order. We're also going to work to reorient all our bilateral alliances to the China challenge in a more direct way, and we see that unfolding. Australia has just released its strategic defense review. But we've already heard about Japan's doubling of its defense budget and move into counter-strike areas. And of course, the important work happening in Seoul with the U.S.-Korea alliance, and I might just return to that briefly at the end of my remarks. Trying to invigorate these mini-lateral organizations, the Quad, AUKUS, other very ad hoc mini-lateral arrangements are an important part of this. And then finally, yes, trying to find that floor and trying to build the guardrails. We do have important work we want to do with China, and it's disappointing when we have an incident like the balloon where phone calls aren't answered or the phones aren't even picked up. We do need to work on global issues, whether that be the next pandemic, whether that be climate change, and I think as Ambassador Bolton mentioned this morning, we would still be very eager to have Chinese support on the North Korea nuclear threat for the betterment of the whole region. So there's an openness on the U.S. side to continuing to engage China, but engage in a very sober-minded, realistic way about what is possible and achievable. But certainly we don't want to neglect that. I do think the U.S.-ROK alliance is very much at the center of thinking in Washington for these challenges. My friend Mike Green has talked about the alliance having this donut hole in the middle. We went global before we went regional. The ROK made very significant deployments, for example, in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, but less regional cooperation off of the peninsula. And I think there are talks underway to improve that, and I'm optimistic about that. But sometimes that takes, very granular work and very granular planning. So we need to get at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to go now to the Japanese speaker, then the dean of multiple schools, James, and give our Korean colleague the opportunity to have the last word before we engage. Ken Jimbo is the president of the Asia Pacific Initiative and a professor on the Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University in Japan. So we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to this excellent gathering. Physically, we've been too long engaging the online meeting for so long, so good to be back. On the turbulent world, I think we can go on so many lists of what, as a trend of what we are facing with, starting from, geopolitics has become the way of life for all of us, and how much that the economic growth and interdependency of the world will not give us a premise that all of those growing states will, go with liberal reforms. Institutional degradations, including UN, WTO, and many of those international organizations have lost their credibilities. And then specific themes like US-China strategic competition, Russian invasion of Ukraine, and all those things are now on the table. But let me leave some positive notes since I'm in Korea. I would like to stress the importance of how much importance we have on connecting the dots of the diplomatic relationship that we have experienced in past months and years, and how much those connecting the dots will create a new landscape of the international relations in making within those turbulent world. One thing I would like to stress, since I'm in Korea, is the Japan-Korea relationship. And I can't stress more how significant the President Yoon Suk-yeol's decision to adopt the resolution, which is mutually acceptable for both in Korea and Japan, which enable the President Yoon's visit to Japan in March 16th with, I think, very credible agreement that we made between two of us. And that will not only encourage to normalize our relationships, including the functioning of the intelligence cooperation between two sides on the GSOMIA, but also that will become the very important platform for the US, Japan, Korea trilateral cooperation to be back on track. And we've got so many things that we need to work on, including a joint planning for the contingency, intelligence sharing in a much more deeper manner, and also higher interoperability among three forces. Ambassador Bolton mentioned about the strike together and the be together within the U.S. Korea relationship, and Randy just mentioned about the Japan adopted the counter-strike capability. But from my perspective, when we go on strike, we have to go strike together with United States and Korea. And this is, I think, one of the most important aspects of finding a kind of common theater and combining those, I think, three capability altogether in trilateral relationship. And I think that is also extending Japan-Korea relationship on the subject of the economic security as well, especially on the maintaining and promoting the supply chain resiliency, especially in the fields of the battery and also the semiconductors and other fields. And I think that bringing Korea back to the white list, which is the preferential trade treatment on the trade relationship, is a great sign to start with. But I think we should go deeper into what kind of trade relationship that we can jointly pursue in this, I think, most important, trends in how we can, like-minded states can promote the economic security. And that will also, generate into our joint perspective on how we converge our Indo-Pacific strategy altogether. So connecting the dots is one thing. It's a bilateral, but that will extend into the wider context. That is, I think, a very important aspect that we can find out. But I can also extend to how important to rejuvenate the U.S. relations with the Philippines as well. It has been unfortunate some years, especially during the Duterte-Obama years, about the stumbling of the alliance relationship between two sides. But with recognition of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement between two sides by developing the more frequent access bases and facilities inside Philippines, that will create the wider strategic depth for the U.S. operation in the theater that will definitely, I think, enhance the credibility of the U.S. engagement in the contingency as well. And then that will provide also the like-minded states like Japan and Australia for access to the Philippines in a much more coordinated manner. Those are something that dots will also create the regional, I think, implications as well. And those are what I mentioned about the competitive elements of the connecting the dots. But I also like to end my statements by another aspect, that is the connecting the dots on the collaborative basis, which is, I think, a quite interesting subject to explore further. For example, I was very surprised to hear the news when China played the intermediary role in, I think, finding the solution, the diplomatic normalization between Saudi and Iran in Beijing. And when I heard the news, I thought that was a joke. But that has been happening as a new trend of what's been happening in the Middle East through the Chinese initiatives. And those have been some kind of the dots also that to be connected. Through the Chinese initiative, we also have to incorporate that aspects. And finally, how much, since we are sitting together, Japan and China create a kind of common agenda for what kind of plausible relationship that we can envisage for the future, also expand the horizon of how much that G7 and G20 can connect it together. Back in 2019 at the Osaka, all United States, Japan, Korea, and also even Russia and China were all collaborated on the various aspects like the credible investment behaviors, environmental standards, data free flow with trust, and that was based on how much that the cohesiveness of such kind of bilateral relationship had been played out inside those multilateral relationships. I'll stop here.
If President Yoon succeeds at bringing Japan and South Korea to bury the hatchet after so many years, that would be a major accomplishment. Our next speaker, I'm sure, has been dean of more public policy schools than anyone in this audience. He began as the dean of the LBJ School of Public Policy in my native Texas. Which you can probably still hear in my accent. And he is now at the Dean of the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, and in between was at the Maxwell School in Syracuse, right?
That's right.
And he's also been in government, so he has an academic and a real perspective.
Thanks, Karen. And like everybody else, it's so great to be back here and be back in person. It really makes a difference to be able to have this kind of interchange and really spend time with each other, which I think we've all missed. And I just want to pick up where both Randy and Ken ended their remarks, because I do think that when we think about, we all agree on the turbulence, but I think we have to keep our eye on some of the great existential challenges of our time. Climate change, pandemic disease, and especially the extraordinary impact that some of these new technologies are going to have on our entire ways of life, on our economy, our society. And these are problems that are not going to get solved by a new NSC 68 or a new national security strategy. We definitely have a problem with China. We need to deal with the problem with China. We have to keep in mind as we construct these things, we have to create a framework that allows us to do these both. And it's hard. It's really very, very difficult, and we've seen the difficulty of doing that. And I think this is where the need to make sure that as we develop these core relationships, which are so important with partners like South Korea, like Japan, in the Quad, which are incredibly valued relationships, that they don't get defined entirely in terms of a new Cold War. that our ability to do this is to be able to sustain these relationships in the context of keeping the world open for the kind of global cooperation that we need to deal with these big problems. And I think the great success of American policy through, frankly, Democratic and Republican administrations after the end of the Cold War, which some seem to be lamenting the loss of, was that we were able to sustain these relationships not in terms of adversarialness with others, but rather of shared interests, shared values, and the desire to cooperate. And if we can sustain that and not ask our partners to see all of our engagement in terms of our competition with China, and to understand that when we work together, we have to do it in a framework to allow these collaborative things to happen, I think we can do the walk and chew gum at the same time thing, which is to deal with the challenge of China. I have no illusions about either the repressive side of Chinese domestic policy nor the coercive side of its external policy, but we still have to cope with these other things. And I think that's why having this understanding about the need of the complementarity, as Ken said, between a G7 and a G20. So it's not all just like-minded institutions. We sustain the like-minded, we create the global institutions, and we leave themselves open to each other that allows us to deal with these two parallel challenges that are necessary to deal with the contemporary turbulence that we face. Thank
you, Jim. Last speaker is the Dr. Yoon, who's chairman of the Asan Institute Policy Studies, and a academic also, a professor emeritus in the Department of Public Science and International Relations at Seoul National University. So you get to conclude this presentation.
Thank you very much. As the newly appointed chairman of the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, I'm deeply honored to extend my sincere gratitude to all the participants here. Thank you very much for attending this conference and sharing your invaluable insights. The title of this panel, The World in Turbulence, provides an opportunity to examine three major international events challenging the rules-based order. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and increasing North Korean nuclear threat and intensifying US-China tension. First, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Violating the UN Charter on Territorial Integrity and Self-Determination cannot be accepted by South Koreans. First, mainly because South Korea benefited from the rules-based international order, which provided a very favorable external environment for developing its economy and democracy in the last 7 decades. And most Koreans want to continue to protect it. In addition, for South Korea, which suffered 35 years of colonialist rule by Japan, cannot accept the world view based on, cannot accept some people's worldview, which is based on the logic of sphere's influence, so-called, or brutal power politics. And I think South Koreans do not wish to witness international relations retrogressing into the 19th century world of imperialism, where might makes right. Finally, South Korea experienced a similar attempt to change territorial border by force when North Korea invaded South in 1950. And this is why South Koreans cannot accept Russia's invasion or attack on Ukraine, because it would legitimize such actions of aggression by North Korea, which was done in 1950. The second factor, which increases turbulence in the world, especially in Northeast Asia, is heightened North Korean security threat. I think this issue will be discussed in other sessions, so I will not elaborate further. But this made the ROK-US alliance even more crucial than at any other time in our history. And the third factor which influences increasing turbulence in the world is intensifying U.S.-China tension. As I already mentioned, most South Koreans want the international relations be based on a kind of rules-based international order, which requires even China to respect such principles like a peaceful resolution of conflict or international law when it deals with such issues like Taiwan Straits or South China Sea issues or etc. Having said that, I'd like to confess that I have some concerns about the current state of the U.S.-China relations. In the Cold War days, there was a de facto code of conduct between the United States and the Soviet Union when they competed against each other. But nowadays, there doesn't seem to be any rules of the game between the United States and China. The relationship between those two big powers is locked in a kind of steady and escalating competition. So I think both countries need to develop a guardrail against some possible crisis situation. On the other hand, recently, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, in his speech at SAIS, demanded a constructive engagement between the United States and China. And he called for more constructive relationship, and he said that American decoupling from China would be disastrous. And Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo made similar remarks. So I'm curious. Do these remarks indicate some kind of course correction by the Biden administration in terms of U.S.-China relationship or not? I'm a little bit confused, so I hope my American colleagues enlighten me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to take the liberty of asking a question and then go. All of you seem so calm. I personally am extremely worried. I was born after World War II, and I'm too young to remember the Korean War, but I'm old enough that in my lifetime, I've never seen what I regard as a situation as bad and with the potential to get so much worse, that we have one hot war between Russia and Ukraine that we're participating in directly in. We could have another in China, Taiwan, and despite the Chinese brokered and Iranian-Saudi agreement, it seems to me there's still a chance for another Middle East war, whether it's the Israelis hitting Iran or and Iran hitting Saudi Arabia, which is what they were trying to avoid. tell me why I should be as calm as you all are.
You shouldn't be calm.
Huh?
You're right. You shouldn't be calm. But I do think it's important to remember, and both of us, Karen, are old enough to remember that we actually have been through very dangerous periods like this before. Remember the Berlin crisis. Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have seen this before,
Yeah.
right? And these are sobering moments for us to think about why this happened. I mean, I do think some of this, the sense of peril has been lost about what we've gone through before. And that's why I think this is a time in which it takes quite a lot of sober leadership among everybody to look hard down at these really terrible dangers that we do face and to take that very seriously. Because I think there's a lot of brave rhetoric that goes on frankly, on both sides of the US-China thing and in some of the other ways we're discussing these issues that is insensitive to the perils that we face. And I think it is a time for us to go back to our history books just to reinstill that sense of fear that might help us all, and I do mean everyone, to think hard about how do we not have to reface those dangers again.
I mean, if you haven't read The Ghost at the Feast, the American absence from the world between 1900 and 1941 by Robert Kagan, it is a book that contributed to my fear, but it certainly describes the U.S. not playing a role, and that seems to be the concern of a lot of people in the world, that we're talking about competing with China, but we're not playing a very constructive role in preparing alliances to actually do that. I mean, Randy outlined a lot of things that are being done, but the audience deserves a chance. Who would like to ask a question of any of these? Nobody has a question? All right, I have more. I always have more. When you say, people all say now, the Saudis, we don't want to choose. The South Koreans, we don't want to choose. We want to have the ability to work with everybody. What happens in the situation where, if things get completely out of hand, and you do have to choose, what does, or does South Korea believe that it has chosen an alliance with the U.S., and you will take John Bolton's advice to make money where you can, but make less of it in China? Is that would that be the South Koreans' answer? We have indeed chosen, we are your partner, let's strengthen?
Yeah, my answer is that South Korea is unique in terms of its geopolitical location and in terms of the fact that it is divided, and we have North Korea, which has been threatening South Korea so seriously. And the fact that we have to confront North Koreans is a matter of life and death. That's exactly why I told that the alliance between the United States and ROK is even more crucial than at any other time. And so I think it was, it was very relieving as a South Korean to witness our President Yoon, decided to revitalize its alliance with the United States and improve its relationship with Japan and aim to make South Korea a global pivotal state. I think that's the right direction for South Koreans to go. But we also have to carefully manage our relationship with China so that we can maintain a bilateral relationship on the basis of a mutual benefit, mutual respect. That kind of principle should be there. So I think, even Chinese policymakers may have to, understand, South Korea's unique position, why they should choose alliance, and why should value, the importance of rules-based international order, because it is basically a small country surrounded by big powers. So rules-based order is so important for South Koreans.
Randy, you wanted to say?
Well, I think that's the key. I was going to make 2 quick points. One is an American official representative of the U.S. government should never go to another capital and say, we'd like to hear your decision, choose between the United States and China. But it's fair to ask, do you want to choose protection of your own sovereignty? Do you want to choose international law and order? Do you want to choose peaceful resolution of disputes? Do you want to choose all of these positive qualities that I think more or less will have countries align with us in what we're trying to do to preserve a free and open order in the Indo-Pacific? The second point is, I think countries don't want to choose, but they really don't want to choose in public. And if you look at even swing states, if you look at the polling and favorabilities of the United States alliances, it's pretty overwhelming support for the U.S. and our objectives and our goals. So we don't have to sort of force this on them. We can look at a place like Vietnam, where we poll as a country 94% favorable, which is just remarkable given how recent our conflict was. Chinese poll 6%.
Interestingly, I'm sorry to mention Saudi Arabia again, but the polling in Saudi Arabia shows that the Saudis prefer China as the country, an important country to have relations with. Russia second, and the U.S. third.
Thank goodness we've got people like you to work on that. But my optimism in the Indo-Pacific, we're in the high 80s in the Philippines, we're in the high 80s in Australia. I mean, I would posit, and our friend Professor Jha can certainly have his say on these matters, but China's best relationship in the Indo-Pacific is about as good as our worst.
Is
about as good as our worst. I mean, in terms of real alignment.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe Burma, not by choice, but by necessity. Maybe Cambodia, not because of the people, but because of Hun Sen and Hun Manet. Maybe Laos, but really, we're doing pretty well. And we have to leverage that in all the right ways, which means don't force these very uncomfortable things on them at a pace and scope they can't absorb and handle. But, I mean, I feel pretty good. Maybe that's why I'm calm. I'm optimistic about our alignment with so many countries who value that free and open order and want that rules-based order, and they still look to us to be the primary guarantor of that.
Ed, yeah.
Let me just throw in one footnote on that, replying to what you asked before, Minister Yoon, Chairman Yoon. The 4 Americans on this panel I've known and worked with over the years, and we all have kind of different domestic political perception, shall we say, but I think each of us would say unanimously, we only have one president at a time. So when a Kurt Campbell working with Joe Biden, neither my closest political ally, comes up with AUKUS, I say, right on, terrific. It's similarly when something happens with a Republican. That's why you've got not only Marco Rubio, Republican from Texas, you got Mark Warner, Democrat from Virginia, both saying, hey, we have to do something about the U.S. relationship with China. That's why you now have this special House Committee on China. On a bipartisan basis, looking at these questions very intensively and very sensibly. But it's I guess this would be another reason why, I guess, like you, Randy, I tend to be a little bit calm right now, because let's all figure out how we can add and multiply, not divide and subtract.
The gentleman in the second row has a question. Yeah, there's the microphone.
Thank you. Is it working? Yeah. Thank you. My name is Nabil. I'm the ambassador of Pakistan. My question is primarily to Professor Steinberg and to Professor Jha. I think one of the things that really struck me about what Mr. Steinberg said was to reinstill the fear. I think that's, to me, is extremely important. I think that fear, if you look at the public pronouncements over the last 10 years, that fear is increasing in the public. But somehow I have a feeling that that fear hasn't come at the top level yet. So how do we reinstill that fear? One way of doing it is what our friend Master Bolton said, to put it in stark contrast of where we are. That is one way of doing it. Is there another way? Because there must be, because that, for me, is the basis on which future cooperation will come. Because unless and until we fear what is coming, we would not be able to really understand and appreciate where we are heading. Thank you.
Did you want James to comment?
Yeah, just
And
one
Professor
more
Zhao.
word on that. I mean, obviously I share the sentiment. I mean, I think we're all kind of historians, right? And many of us have spent a lot of time looking at World War I and that wonderful book by Christopher Clark called The Sleepwalkers. As another case of reminding us, you talked about Bob's book about the 30s. I mean, I do think that often we do get in trouble by thinking that there's a divine providence that's going to save ourselves from ourselves, right? And that this is in our hands, right? I'm not a pessimist. I am fearful, but not a pessimist. I mean, I do believe that we can do this, and I think that there are sensible policies, and I don't think they're partisan policies that can deal with this. And I hope others do the same. I worry, frankly, on the Chinese side, whether there is the same sense of fear. I think there's a recklessness in the Chinese policies these days, which worries me a great deal. But that's why I think your point is so important. I mean, I hope that our leaders in China and our friends who speak to our leaders in China, have the same sense that we can't guarantee that, just continuing to go down this path is going to save ourselves. And we know where the flashpoints are, we know the dangers are, and we should not sleepwalk into this. So I think it's really quite important for us to do this, not out of a sense of panic, but a sense of awareness of the dangers.
We do have a tendency, I think, in the U.S. to swing from the Chinese are going to be loving little Democrats like us if we just, make them rich, to, oh my God, it didn't work, let's snuff them out. The swing back and forth is not necessarily helpful for anybody. Does anyone else want to ask a question? Dr. Zhao, would you like to say something since you started us off?
Well, I don't know what I should say because we are in a very difficult period. Every country is somehow responsible for this. And blaming China does not help to solve the problem. I think, as I argued in my opening remarks, that we should, in every country, we have pragmatists, we have rational people, we also have fundamentalists, both in ideology and in security. Okay? And too much over the past few years, we have let the demagogues, the ideological and security fundamentalists to define our interactions. Okay? I think it's time for the rationalist pragmatists to take back the initiative. China and the US are not enemies. Okay? We are stakeholders to some extent of the existing international order. China used to be aimed at overthrowing the existing international order before the 1970s because China was outside the system. Okay? But after that, China had become a stakeholder. We want peace, we want stability, we want prosperity, we want an open and free trading system. Okay? And we want a non-nuclear proliferation. Okay? But the problem is our relationship has become so tense. We're not focusing on those things.
Can I ask, I know you don't speak for the Chinese government, but somebody mentioned, that we don't have the kind of high-level, in-touch mechanisms we had with the Soviet Union. Why is China reluctant to set up that kind of, to take the phone call, to have the ability to keep things from getting out of hand?
I don't know the specific reason for that individual not taking the phone call, but I suspect it's politics at home. It has nothing to do with the rationale of communication. It's the guy who is in charge, he does not want to make a mistake. He's worried about his political position. If takes the phone call, what would he say? Would he make a mistake? Or that sort of thing. I think that trumped the relationship. It's personal concerns.
It seems to me that would be an extremely good idea. I mean, I am old enough to remember
how can
the
we
Cuban
assure
Missile
each other?
Crisis.
How can we assure each other that this kind of communication is not for political posturing, is for real? So we need at least some minimum level of trust between our two countries at this stage.
Which doesn't exist.
Exactly.
I agree, yeah. Any other question, or two in the back, and then we will close out so everyone can eat lunch.
So this is Chu Ping Hu from National University of Malaysia. So since the panelists mentioned about the US-Philippine alliance, so from my understanding, the US actually requested some northern islands of the Luzon, and that was declined by the Philippines for fear of, so they are trying to draw the bottom line of linking their role in South China Sea that can be extended to the Taiwan Straits crisis. So from the earlier opening remarks and congratulatory remarks, it's also shown that the Americans have the intention to encourage South Korea to engage or to relate more to the Taiwan Straits crisis. So to Chairman Yoon, do you think, is there any bottom line that South Korea would draw? And to the American panelists, is the interconnected sub-region contingency is part of U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy? Thank you.
Let me explain, typical South Koreans' position on the Taiwan issue. They are, frankly speaking, they are more concerned about what North Korea would do if something happens in the Taiwan Straits. That's their primary concern. So in order to, make some assurance that, South Korea can take some actions, there should be some kind of assurance that there will be enough measures taken to prevent North Korea's taking some, actions, undesirable actions, like attacking South Korea, for example, in one way or another.
So you're saying that South Korea is concerned that if you participated with the U.S. in a conflagration over Taiwan, that North Korea would take advantage of that?
For example, yes, let me say this way. If U.S. troops transferred to the Taiwan Straits, that will create some kind of strategic vacuum. And North Koreans or even Chinese may try to take advantage of that kind of vacuum. And that's what South Koreans are concerned first.
We have 1 minute left. Does any American want to answer her question to the...
I can take a crack at it.
Okay.
Look, if you disaggregate the overall policy of trying to orient alliances, partnerships toward the greater challenges that China's posing. Disaggregate that. Along the way, there are difficult decisions that are sovereign decisions that countries have to make. And we need to meet countries where they are in each instance. I think with the Philippines, it took political change in both countries, frankly. Trump to Biden and then Duterte to Marcos. And I think, you know, the addition of 4 ECTA sites is significant, particularly where they are on Palawan and northern Luzon. And, you know, to the untrained eye, it looks like they're for the purposes of preparing for a Taiwan contingency. But obviously, the government in Manila has some say in that and is going to occasionally exert, you know, the anxieties they might feel about taking these very significant steps forward. So, you know, I think the general trend we're seeing is a lot of agreement among partners and allies to be a facilitator for our access opportunities. But obviously, along the way, you know, these are going to be measured steps and very consistent with the pace and scope that our partner country can bear.
Thank you, all of you, for your comments, your participation. Please join me in thanking the panel.